picture this, in 1956, two teenagers, sisters Barbara and Patricia Grimes, head out for a low-key night at the movies to watch an Elvis Presley film, Love Me Tenderly. 3 hours later, they vanish without a trace. No note, no ransom demands, just two empty seats at the family table and a family plunged into a nightmare. Today on True Crime and Tea, we're going to trace every little twist of this case, and what we're going to ask is what really happened to the Grimes sisters. Now, this is my first unsolved mystery, because you will find that this is an unsolved mystery case. It has till now not been solved, and this happened over 70 years ago. But we're going to look at the facts and see if we can dissect some of the truths and see if some of the further investigations outside of the initial investigation give us some clues as to what actually happened to the Grimes sisters. I'm your host Lele, so welcome back, and if you haven't been here before, welcome. I am a previous lecturer, a researcher and an unapologetic true crime lover, and I'm a mother, and most of my videos so far have included some form of mother, whether it's the mother of the victim or the mother of the crime. I always try and sprinkle in a bit of motherhood there, because this is the first time you're sitting down with an academic mama who likes to talk about true crime and academic tea. So today's case is going to be about the Grimes sisters. It does have a trigger warning because there's some elements that may be a bit disturbing to viewers. So if you think this may not be something that you can watch, then there are other videos in the roster that you can go and watch, and we will be sad to say goodbye, but we understand. But if you're like me and you're a true crime lover and you are here to get a bit of insight into these true crime cases with a sprinkle of academic tea and critical thinking, then stay tuned and let's get into it. And for some reason I have done the last two of these with a pen in my hand, and I don't understand why, because this is academic tea, so I should be drinking my tea. I have got sarsaparilla in here today. It's actually cold because it's very, very warm at the moment in the UK, so we haven't got hot tea today, we've got something cold. This is true crime and academic tea, so I may sometimes make outlandish comments about the victims through an academic lens, and what I mean by that is may speak about the criminal in a certain type of light, and it sometimes may sound like a justification for their actions. For example, when it comes to one of the cases I've looked at recently, Andrea Yates, she was a mum who unalived her 5 children, and she was suffering with severe postpartum psychosis. Now, we look at postpartum psychosis and how this could have impacted the situation and how it could have contributed to the outcome in that case, but these academic deep dives are in no way there to negate what the person has done. It's not a justification for their actions, it's just a view through an academic lens. So now we've got that out of the way, I've rambled on quite a bit, so let's just get into the story. In post-war America, Chicago pulsed with optimism, shiny new cars, rock and roll on the radio, and budget-in suburbs where young families thrived. But underneath the drive-in glamour lurked the real and sometimes terrifying underbelly of urban life. Loretta Grimes raised 5 children in a working class household. Barbara, 15, and Patricia, 13, were the bright and popular sisters who saved up for weeks to splurge on tickets. It was supposed to be a fun night out for Barbara and Patricia Grimes, who ventured from their Chicago area home on December the 28th, 1956, to see Elvis Presley in a new film. But Love Me Tender ended, and the two sisters, aged 13 and 15, never showed up at the bus stop, where they had plans to meet their older sister and younger brother before heading back home. Weeks later, a gruesome discovery was made which would confirm the terrible truth for the Grimes family. The two young sisters were never coming back home. This 1956 murder case, despite renewed interest in the case, has remained a cold case for over 70 years. There have been several interests from retired local detectives who have vowed that this case can be solved. Several reliable sightings at the theatre determined that the two sisters did actually arrive at the cinema. A friend had sat behind them during the film, and this same friend later spotted them in the line to purchase snacks. So there were people that had identified that they were actually there on the day. However, when the girls never showed up to meet their siblings and they didn't return home later that evening, the Grimes family obviously got worried the children are missing and they contacted the police. The bus times came and went, and the longer the time went on, the more that the mother, Loretta, knew that something was wrong. When they didn't arrive home by midnight, their mum, Loretta Grimes, obviously became worried, and she sent out two of her children to the bus stop closest to the home and asked them to wait for their sisters there. However, several buses passed by and the sisters were not on any of them. At a little after 2 o'clock in the morning, on the morning of December 29th, their mother then called the police, and within a week, the law enforcement authorities determined that it was unlikely that Patricia and Barbara were going to return. The search for the girls became one of the most intensive missing person searches in the history of the Chicagoland area. It was reported that several hundred police officers were involved in the search, and several officers joined the search, and the search lasted more than 3 weeks in the coldest months of winter. This is December, so it would have been extremely cold, and it would have been extremely concerning that the girls would have been out in this weather for this long period that the search was taking place. In the subsequent days, police officers then fanned out across the Chicago area. They found people that were eagerly reporting to have seen the girls, and it became a headache to the police because all of these sightings had to be further investigated. In the days after they went missing and they were reported by their mother, Loretta, police found out across the main Chicago areas, and they found people who were eagerly reporting sightings of the sisters. And it became somewhat of a headache for them because they was getting so many reports of so many different sightings, and alleged sightings. And just to name a few of these sightings, some people stated that they witnessed two young girls matching the description of the Grimes sisters get on a bus heading east into the heart of Chicago. However, nobody saw these girls get off the bus on any of the stops on the route. Similarly, a train conductor claims to have seen them on a train near the Chicago suburb of Glenview. Then a security guard claimed he was asked for directions by two young girls the night of their disappearance. So that would have been on the night of the 28th of December. And then on the evening of the 29th of December, a fellow student of Patricia reportedly saw her walking past a restaurant in the company of two other girls. Neither of those girls, though, was Barbara. So if that alleged sighting was valid, where was Barbara? Okay. Then another report was that a restaurant worker had seen a sighting early on in the morning of the 30th, so 2 days after they went missing. He said they were in the company of a man at this point, and that one of the girls acted sickly or drunk and needed assistance when walking. So essentially, they could have been taken by this man, taken to get something to eat at this restaurant, and this is where the hostess or the bartender, it would have been a waitress, would have seen them in the restaurant. That was another sighting. A hotel clerk stated the girls briefly stayed at his hotel. A clerk at another hotel claimed he refused them a room due to their young age, because remember, there was 15 and 13 at the time of their disappearance. Several days later, so several days after they went missing, employees of a department store reported seeing the Grimes sisters in their store listening to Elvis Presley records. I don't know about that one. Most mysteriously, though, about 2 weeks after the girls' disappearance, so 2 weeks after they went missing, so this would have been second week of January, a classmate of Patricia received 2 puzzling phone calls near midnight. During the first call, the party on the other line was silent. A voice the mother, so Loretta, was sure was Patricia's, said, "Is that you, Sandra? Is Sandra there?" And then the caller hung up. So many think the call was a hoax, especially given the fact that the mum thought it sounded so much like Patricia. But a mum would know, wouldn't she? A mum would know if that was the sound of her daughter's voice. While all the searches were taking place, even Elvis Presley himself made a public plea for the girls' safe return, but still the Grimes family was left without any answers until late January of 1957, when a gruesome discovery confirmed their worst fears. The search for Barbara and Patricia ended when a local man discovered their abandoned bodies naked in the snow on January the 22nd, 1957, along a road in Willow Springs, Illinois, a western suburb of Chicago. And although they had been found, an autopsy initially ruled that they had likely died because of the freezing weather. At the time, it was the depth of winter. So the autopsy found that they had died because of the freezing weather, but police still ruled their deaths as homicides, which is interesting because this is essentially the reason why this is still an open case, or a cold case, as they would call it. The sisters' autopsies were performed the day following their discovery. So January 23rd is when these autopsies would have been performed, because they were found on January the 22nd. And the autopsies would be performed by 3 experienced forensic pathologists who, following a 5-hour examination of each of the bodies, they were actually unable to agree on a date or a cause of death. So they couldn't actually agree on when they think the girls may have been, when they passed away, and they couldn't agree on a cause of death. So that's where we got the kind of umbrella term that they possibly died from the freezing cold weather, but that's not a definitive. Everybody agreed that that was the reason for their death. And the experts, though, did determine that when they did the examinations, the sisters' stomach contents contained the approximate proportions of their last known meals and snacks that the sisters would have had on the evening of December the 28th. I'm not a pathologist, but I would assume if the contents of December the 28th is still in their system, potentially does that not mean they died probably on the 29th? I don't know. I'm not a forensic pathologist, but I feel like if there's nothing else in their stomach at that point, they probably didn't eat anything after then. That was the conclusion. The conclusion was that both of the girls had most likely died approximately 5 hours after they had last been seen alive at the Brighton Theatre, so on the 28th of December. And remember, they were seen by one of their friends who saw, I think it was Barbara, at the snack kiosk getting snacks after the film. So potentially they've died within 5 hours of that sighting, either on the evening of the 28th or early morning of the 29th of December. The cause of death in each case was ruled to be a combination of shock and exposure. And although each of the pathologists had come to the conclusion via a process of elimination, they hadn't actually said definitively that was the reason. It was basically a checklist. Okay, it's not that. Okay, it's not that. Okay, it's not that. Okay, it's not that. Possibly it's because of shock and exposure. In addition, the experts concluded that a lot of the wounds that had been present on the sisters' bodies were most likely inflicted because of rodents, and that the actual puncture wounds that they had seen on their bodies was post-mortem, so it would have happened after they had died, as opposed to someone inflicting those wounds on them before they had died. So what this means was there was no obvious fatal wounds discovered on their bodies. Everything that was discovered, they just assumed that they had become present because of the animals surrounding animals at the time just seeing a potential of something to eat. And the toxicology reports revealed that neither of the girls had been drunk, drugged, or poisoned prior to their death. So that sighting of the girl that was a bit wavy potentially was invalid, because at this point, when they did the toxicology report, there wasn't any substances or alcohol in their system. No items of clothing were found ever for either of the sisters. However, their bodies were stated to be by the pathologist extremely clean, which is also weird, because where did their clothes go? And I know there's this concept, like the girl from the Cecil Hotel, which I will cover because I also find that extremely mysterious. That is another unsolved case. But when you get so cold, your body is tricked into thinking that you need to take your clothes off in order to warm up. So potentially this could have been the same for the Grimes sisters. The autopsy would discover that Barbara had likely engaged in coitus, intercourse with someone, either consensually or unconsensually. So again, this was something that they couldn't confirm. They couldn't confirm if she had been essayed or if she had willingly had relations with someone around the time of her death, although no evidence of forcible essay was found during the autopsy. So this could mean that probably potentially before they went to the cinema, she had a boyfriend and they had a bit of fun. Or it could also mean that part of their disappearance was because of untoward events happening, but this was never really confirmed. And the official death certificates of both Barbara and Patricia would list their causes of death to be homicide. So even though they couldn't rule that certain things out, they still listed their deaths as homicide, with the specific means for both of those cases being listed as secondary shock, resulting in the exposure to extremely low temperatures. Obviously it was wintertime, which had reduced their body temperatures below critical level compatible with life. This is what was noted in their autopsy reports. One of the coroners who performed the autopsies, Warren Macron, said that the sisters' bodies had laid undiscovered behind the guardrail on a German church road for many days before their eventual discovery, stating that the bodies' markedly preserved condition, given the time interval between their disappearances and discovery, had been due to the frigid temperatures in the weeks prior to January the 22nd, adding that this had been due to the recent snowfall and the frigid climate. So essentially what he's saying is the reason why their body is in pristine condition, why it has been preserved so well and why it is so clean, is because at the time it was frosty, ice, snowy, cold. So ice preserves materials. So essentially they looked the way they did because it was so cold, because the weather was below freezing. And Macron also concluded that the girls' bodies had laid undiscovered for more than 3 weeks because a layer of the snow that had blanketed the area on January the 9th, and that this snowfall had rapidly melted in the days immediately prior to their discovery. So I also feel like that's a bit of if the snow had fell on January the 9th, then what about from the 29th of December until the 8th of January? Because though the temperatures were warm, there wasn't snowfall to preserve those bodies. So decomp would have happened between that week. So I don't know about that. I feel like that's a bit misleading. Again, I'm not a forensic pathologist, so that is just the way I'm interpreting the information. It doesn't sound like that makes sense. They laid there for over 3 weeks. However, the rainfall began and blanketed the area on the 9th of January. So what happened between the 29th/30th of December until the 8th? Where were they then? It's just a bit confusing. But despite the official conclusions, the chief investigator for the Cook County Coroner's Office, Harry Gloss, disagreed with the official time of death, later stating to the media there had been numerous marks of violence on both of the girls' faces, even though the autopsy said that any wounds that they saw were post-mortem and were due to animal activity. Bit of a contradiction there. And that it was strongly indicative of there being the recipient of violence as opposed to a post-mortem rodent infestation. He also contended that a thin layer of ice found encrusted upon the sisters' bodies indicated that they had most likely been alive until at least January the 7th, which is what I just said, because it doesn't make sense, right? Since only after that date would there have been sufficient snowfall to react with the girls' natural body heat in such a climate, and therefore the layer of ice that was discovered on their bodies, which were nude in this location, would have only happened after the fact. I hope you're still with me, because yes, it sounds extremely confusing, but what he's essentially saying is what I've just said. They must have been alive up until the 7th of January, because if they were discarded on the 30th of December, there was no snowfall until the 8th of January, 8th or 9th of January, when it actually settled. So when they found them under the layer of snow so well preserved, that essentially wouldn't have been able to happen prior to the 7th of January, because there would have had to be some decomp happening if, I said it out loud and it just sounds extremely confusing, but it does make sense. Gloss contended this proved their bodies had been warm when they had been deposited beside German Church Road, since only after January the 7th had there been sufficient snow to create such an ice layer upon and around their bodies. In addition to these facts, he had also stated that both girls had been subject to SA, which is what we alluded to earlier on, throughout their time that they had potentially had been in captivity. So he's going along the lines of them being essentially kidnapped and held somewhere, being essayed through the whole period of time while they was there. And he added that the autopsy conducted upon Patricia had discovered male fluids within her female fluids that were swabbed from her body at the time, and that curdled milk had also been found in Barbara's stomach when she is not known to have drunk milk either at their home or at the cinema on the night of December the 28th. I don't know how they would know whether or not she drank milk on the night of December the 28th, because they didn't have any record of receipts or anything like that. So I feel like that can be disputed. But he's essentially saying, how could there have been milk in her stomach when we're saying she didn't drink milk before that time? So two conflicting stories there. One from the forensic pathologists, who the three of them couldn't even agree on the time of death or how they died. So already the autopsy's up in the air. But then also this detective picking a lot of holes actually in the story that was told, or the final documented report from the forensic pathologist, because where we can agree and say it's weird and it's definitely homicide, what the pathologists have written down doesn't essentially give us room to agree with them with their findings. So let's talk about the suspects, because there were a few suspects, and again, no one can really agree on the suspects either when it comes to the police theories and the suspects. So the search for the killers became very complicated when the pathologist autopsies and the chief investigator of the county coroner's office could not agree on a time of death, because it leaves so much room for interpretation or misinterpretation. And similar to this, not having a cause of death also left area for uncertainty due to the really strange wounds that they found on the bodies. The pathologist said it was due to rodent activity, whereas the lead investigator was saying no, this is not the reason why. The police conducted a very extensive search for possible culprits, and they finally focused on 3 likely suspects. The first suspect, or one of the suspects, was Edward Benny Bedwell, and he was a homeless man from Tennessee. He initially had admitted to actually committing the crime and unaliving the Grimes sisters. However, he later recanted his story and said that he was forced by the police to confess, and they had forced him into a false confession by basically beating him up and making him confess. So that was Benny Bedwell. The next person was Max Fleeg, or Fleege, however you think it should be pronounced, a young man in his teens, and he had actually admitted to the crimes in a polygraph test. However, Illinois law considered it illegal to polygraph a juvenile because he was a teenager at the time of taking the polygraph test. And what this meant was that he got released by the police. However, Max Fleeg then went on to commit another homicide of a young woman after he had been released, and subsequently went to prison after this. However, there's still that open potential that because he had done this polygraph test, it wasn't shown that he was innocent when he had admitted to the crime, and yet he was never convicted of it. So yes, he was in prison for something else, but this left the Grimes sisters' homicide open for discussion, because we're still discussing it now as a cold case. And then the last person was Walter Krantz. He was a man in his early 50s, and he considered himself to be somewhat of a clairvoyant, a psychic. And before the discoveries of the bodies, Krantz had actually called the police station and said that he dreamed of the location. And the location that he disclosed was scarily accurate. It was the location that these sisters had been found in. Police grilled him, but they were unable to come up with enough evidence to proceed. Now, am I saying that he is the person responsible for this? No. The fact that he knows exactly where the locations they would be found in was so accurate is a bit scary. However, there have actually been quite a few cases that have been solved through psychics or people who have certain abilities. So do I think him knowing where the location of the bodies were is enough to convict him? No. I feel like some people have probably got gifts, and maybe he did see this location in a dream and he thought it was just time to share what he saw in a dream, and he just so happened to be correct. Not every time do these things stick. Sometimes yes, if it's a spade, call it a spade. However, in this instance, he was released because there was not enough evidence to convict him. So despite a lengthy investigation into these 3 people and into the crime, it still remains unsolved all these years later. The police actually interviewed over 300,000 different individuals with no credible suspects identified by the end of all of these investigations. So they did a lot of work. 300,000 people is a lot of people. However, it was to no avail because it is still an open case. Now, there was a call, and it's the taunting finale that left Loretta Grimes shattered and with nowhere to turn. In May 1957, Loretta Grimes received an anonymous call from an individual who claimed to be the person who had undressed and committed the homicide of her 2 daughters, Barbara and Patricia. Although the family had received numerous hoax phone calls, which I think is inherently evil, Anybody that can call someone and pretend to be knowledgeable or involved in such devastating cases like these really needs their head checked. I just make it make sense. Okay. However, even though they had received all of these hoax calls following their daughter's disappearance, this particular caller had ridiculed the police prior to this, and the ridicule of the police was linked to them blaming suspects like Edward Bedwell. This person ended the phone call with information indicating that he may have been the perpetrator of this crime. And what he said was, "I know something about your little girl that no one else knows, not even the police. The smallest girl's toes were crossed at the feet." Ugh, that is creepy. The caller then laughed before terminating the call. If this was a hoax, may God have mercy on their souls, because that is disgusting. That is disgusting. 1 year after the homicide of her daughters, Loretta publicly stated her conviction that her daughters had been killed by an individual that they had known, stating that although the weather had been bitterly cold on the night of their abduction, Barbara and Patricia would have never entered a vehicle driven by an individual unknown to them, regardless of any discomfort. So essentially she's saying, my daughters are smart enough to know not to get in no stranger's car, regardless of whether it's hot, cold, raining, sleet, snow. They would not travel with someone that they didn't know. So the only explanation for this could be that the homicide was committed by someone that they knew. Chicago detectives soon zeroed in on Benny Bedwell, an out-of-state drifter who was spotted with the girls by witnesses, according to one of the local radio stations. And police thought the case was closed when Bedwell confessed to the crimes, but he later recanted his statements and said that he was beaten by the police into a confession. So it has been decades since this trial has gone cold, since this case has gone cold, but there is still invested interest in finding out what happened to the Grimes sisters. And there have been a few retired Chicago police that have still been investigating the case, still keeping it alive. Retired police detective named James Hennigan has dedicated a great proportion of his time to unraveling the truths behind this case and solving this case, and he spent a large amount of his retirement doing this. One of Hennigan's leading theories in the Grimes sisters' disappearance and homicide is that it had a possible link to a 1955 murder of 3 young brothers named John, Anton and Robert Schusler. I think I'm saying it correctly. And the Schlusser boys seem to have gone missing in a similar way to how the Grimes sisters had gone missing. They went to the movies just like the Grimes sisters and never returned, again like the Grimes sisters. Now that in itself doesn't make it it's a open and shut case. They're exactly the same case, but there are some similarities there because they were later discovered naked in a forest preserve in the northwest side of Chicago. However, retired police officer Ray Johnson has also dedicated quite a lot of his time into this investigation and grew his interest in this case in around 2010, where he began his own unofficial investigation into the Grimes sisters' disappearance and homicide. He believes that the cold case is solvable, as others have said in the past. And according to Johnson, Charles Leroy Melquist, who committed a homicide of a 15-year-old called Bonnie Lee Scott in 1958, is the potential culprit and murderer in this case. Johnson noted the similarities in the murders, but police have never questioned Malquist about Barbara and Patricia Grimes. So they have seen some similarities, but no one's actually gone to Charles Melquist and actually investigated and sat him down in an interrogation room and asked him whether or not he has involvement in this case. Ray Johnson thinks public assistance can help crack the case, and he made a video which you can find on YouTube, which he goes into a bit more detail into how he feels that this case can be solved. Now, Charles Melquist had originally been convicted of a crime that he committed in September 1958 of a 15-year-old girl named Bonnie Lee Scott, whom he had known prior to the murder. Remember, the mother said that the Grimes sisters would not have gotten into a car with someone they didn't know. So similarly, Bonnie Lee Scott knew Melquist, they were acquaintances, and her body was later found decapitated 2 months after her disappearance. She was actually found less than 10 miles away from where the Grimes sisters had been discovered when they were found in the January. Following the discovery of Scott's bodies, the investigators had noticed similarities between this homicide and body disposal methods and that of the Grimes sisters. However, Melquist was never investigated. He was never questioned about his possible involvement in the Grimes sisters' disappearance and homicide, as his attorney had forbidden him to be subject to questioning, which I find interesting, because what does that mean? You know, you've got attorney-client privilege. Could that potentially have meant that he had admitted something to his attorney and then he just had said, you are not allowed to speak to the investigators on this? Because obviously there was nothing concrete. There's no physical evidence pointing or linking anybody to the Grimes sisters case. So essentially they had nothing to question him on, but he may have said things in an investigation that would have led them to believe that he was the culprit. The day after the discovery of the body of Bonnie Lee Scott, Loretta Grimes, the mother of Patricia and Barbara, received a phone call from an individual who had confessed to the homicide of Scott. And what they said was, I've committed another perfect crime. This is another one those cops won't solve, and they're not going to affix blame onto Bedwell or Barry Cook. So this is supposedly the second call that Loretta Grimes has received from the potential killer in these two cases. Obviously, Melquist was discovered as the culprit in the Scott case. However, someone is clearly taking credit for these two crimes. Loretta Grimes would remain adamant until her death that this caller had been the same individual who had contacted her in May of 1957 and had revealed the deformity on one of her daughter's feet, which had never been released to the press or the public, stating, I will never forget that voice. That is a chilling fact. So someone was clearly out there who had obviously committed this crime. They were the only one that was privy to the deformity that her daughter had had. Now, that could have led to two different outcomes. It could have potentially been a hoax being done by one of the detectives and someone involved in the case, which is weird. Or it could have been the culprit. It could have been the person who had committed the homicides, and it was probably an inside job or something like that, because that information was never released to the public. And like Loretta Grimes said, it could have potentially been someone that they knew, which is why they knew about the deformity. However, Charles Melquist and nobody else has ever been charged with the alleged involvement in Melquist's case in the deaths of the Grimes sisters, and he died in 2010, funny enough, around the same time where Ray Johnson then became interested in this case. So that is quite interesting, I think. So in the 1950s, crime reporting struck fear throughout America. Were the Grimes sisters' story and its coverage feeding a culture of suburban paranoia? The 1950s in America was marked by a burgeoning media landscape that increasingly sensationalized crime reporting. There have been discussions on how mid-century press tactics often amplified public fear by focusing on on lurid details and dramatic narratives. Grimes Sisters case involving the homicide of 2 young girls in Chicago is a prime example. The extensive media coverage not only highlighted the gruesome aspect of the crime, but also played into existing societal anxieties about safety in suburban areas. There is a concept of how moral panic further elucidates this phenomenon. It speaks about how the media can create this folk devil and amplify societal fears, leading to a heightened public concern. And often this is done with really disproportionate responses. People have blown things way out of proportion, but because of the way the media portrays these instances, yes, there is someone going around, or maybe there wasn't, but the point is, the media portrays this in the sense that there is fear instilled in people because someone is going around grabbing young children out of the theatres and then decapitating their bodies and leaving them in the freezing cold. But when you look at the 2 cases of the Grimes sisters and the Scott case, in the Scott case, she was decapitated, whereas the Grimes sisters were left in almost perfect condition. No, they weren't clothed, they were naked. However, there would be more belief in linking the Grimes sisters to the case of the Slusher brothers because they were both left in similar conditions, as opposed to the Scott Melquist case where he took time to decapitate her body and leave her in a location that may or may not have been similar to where the Grimes sisters were found. So the creation of paranoia can be made through the way that the media portrayed the possible links with these 2 cases, even though there was never an investigation into Melquist and he was never really linked with the Grimes sisters. Media sensationalization may have created such a fear and paranoia in the public that it may have prevented families from letting their young children or their young, they were young, they were 15 and 13, so their young children going to the movies by themselves. There's also the concept of gender and vulnerability. The 2 young sisters were on an innocent night out. They were just going to watch a movie, an Elvis movie, but they became symbols for female vulnerability in public spaces. They were in a public space but vanished without a trace. Nobody saw them after they left that theatre. And the tragic narrative that is built around the Grimes sisters also underscores the theme of gender and vulnerability. 2 young females out on their own, no protection. There's a theory of the male gaze that in true crime narratives suggests that women are often depicted as passive victims. It reinforces the patriarchal view of females and female vulnerability, meaning that in this particular case, the Grimes sisters were portrayed not just as victims of such a heinous crime, but also as symbols of the inherent dangers faced by women in public spaces. Anywhere that you go, even if it's a public space, you are vulnerable because you are a woman. So in this particular case, they are the poster children for female vulnerability. Some may look at this in a completely opposite view, and where you can use critique of victim blaming, that can also be brought up in this case. Certain critics argue that the societal narratives often shifts the focus to the perpetrator of the crime, and it shifts the focus from the perpetrator to the victim, scrutinizing the Grimes sisters' behaviors or the victims' behaviors and their choices. Case being that the Grimes sisters chose to go out on their own to a movie. They had them put themselves in a position of vulnerability because they are young, because they are women, because they are in a space where they're not protected by a man, that they opened themselves up to the dangers that are out there. The perpetrator was in a position where they were they were in the right place at the right time. However, in this case, you can't have the discussion without thinking about those concepts, because they were out late, by themselves. They were unaccompanied. They didn't have any parents or an older person with them looking out for them in this space. That's where the blame can kind of shift from the perpetrator to the Grimes sisters as victims. However, when I think about that concept, it also makes me think, actually, does that responsibility not fall to the parents? The parents made the choice to allow their children, their two daughters, to go out on their own in a bustling city, Chicago, late at night with no chaperone, no authority figure. How can that blame shift to the Grimes sisters if the responsibility should really lie with the parents? However, this is 1957. This is a time where people were still hitchhiking. How many cases have we looked at, and are we going to look at, where hitchhiking was the thing? Nobody seemed to feel worried about jumping into a random person's car, where people used to leave their front doors open and make it easy for perpetrators to come into the house. However, at these times, the argument is that it was such a safe time, essentially, and therefore shifting the blame from the perpetrator to the victim, to me, doesn't really make sense when society at the time was set up for it to be safe for children to be out by themselves at night, and they had made arrangements to be picked up by their siblings. So I don't know about that. In the Grimes sisters case in particular, the discussions about the girls being out late and being unaccompanied, it subtly shifts the blame onto them because of those circumstances, perpetrating a culture that holds women responsible for their own victimization. So in other words, saying you should understand the time, the society, and the types of people that are out there. Why would you put yourself in a position of danger? However, I'm going to continue to say this. I still think the responsibility lies with the parents. They were 13 and 15. I mean, need I say more? And then let's think about forensic evolution since 1957. So the controversy of the rodent bites. The rodent bites were what the forensic pathologists, that was their explanation for the puncture wounds that they found on the Grimes sisters when they did the autopsy. And the puncture wound controversies and conflicting autopsies spotlight how young, how much in its infancy the forensic pathology was at that time, compared to what modern day forensic pathology looks like when it comes to DNA, luminol scans, and geographic profiling. There is so much more that can be done now compared to what was done in 1957, that you can't really fault the forensic pathologists for their findings. Potentially now, when they looked at those wounds, or when they swabbed those wounds, they would have been able to look at DNA and say, well, this is human DNA and this is animal DNA. So they would have been able to differentiate those wounds that way. Whereas back then it was a puncture wound that was found out in the open. The only answer they came up with was their rodent bites. So the investigation in that sense, you can't really fault it given the equipment they had at the time, the knowledge they had at the time. The forensic investigation of the Grimes sisters case in 1957, it was marred by controversy, including the debates over the rodent bites and the conflicting autopsy report, because they couldn't even agree on what the cause of deaths were. And this reflects the techniques at the time heavily relied on rudimentary techniques. They were outdated and subjective, and their interpretation of the data was very subjective. And we constantly talk about objectivity versus subjectivity in academic writing, in academia. So understanding what subjectivity means, it was the opinion of the pathologist, which could even open and give room to them having conflicting findings. If it was more objective, they would have had to almost come to an agreed conclusion, which they were unable to do. And that is in great contrast to modern forensic science, which has completely transformed and evolved drastically. Today, DNA analysis, luminol scans for detecting certain blood traces and fluids, and geographic profiling are all standard tools. They're all things that help to provide an objective, reliable view of the data that is being collected. So when they were going to look at the situation and look at the crime scene, even back then there was a lot of involvement and a lot of destruction of crime scenes, whereas now they have certain processes that are standard processes, standard procedure that they've put in place to allow the collection of data to be reliable and valid. Obviously, there are things like cross-contamination and stuff like that that gets in the way. However, there are things that are being used that provide a more objective and reliable data source. And these advancements have revolutionized criminal investigations, allowing for more precise and conclusive results. The comparison between the 1950s and the 2020s investigative toolkits highlights the significant strides that have been made in forensic technology and methodology, underscoring the importance of scientific progress in the pursuit of justice. I've spoken about justice in another case, the Tiandra Chisholm case, Hosanna's failure of the systems that failed her. Please go and look at it, because she was not given justice. And though there have been strides since 1950s to the 2020s, I would argue that there's still not enough, because that case left me very unhappy because there was not really any justice. However, the difference between what was available in the 1950s to what is available now in the 2020s is very, very different. And again, it does show the need for constant progress in the scientific field. So where there is research happening, this is a great thing, because it means the difference between identifying the culprit of the Grimes sisters potentially and putting the right people behind bars for a very, very long time. So the Grimes sisters case still remains unsolved. It is still one of Chicago's most haunting cold cases. Despite thousands of hours of investigation, 300,000 people were questioned, not Melquist, out of those 300,000, which is really wild, but 300,000 people were questioned. We still do not know who was responsible for the disappearance and homicide of the Grimes sisters. But every theory, every anonymous tip, every investigator's hunch brings us ever more closer to uncovering who was responsible for the disappearance and homicide of the Grimes sisters. What do you think about this case? Do you think that forensics is going to be the way to crack this unsolved mystery? Do you think that it is more going to be led down the questioning and investigation route that Ray Johnson may be taking, and some of the other detectives that were involved in this case and are still looking at the case in their retirement? What do you think? How do you think this case is going to be solved? Is it going to be solved? What do you think? Drop your thoughts below in the comments and let me know what your thoughts are. And as always, if you like content like this, don't forget to like. Until next time, let's go and pour another cup of tea or make ourselves a nice cool iced latte, because it is actually quite warm at the moment, and keep questioning the stories that shape our world. Keep your critical hats on, and I will see you in the next video. Bye. Part 15,000.